Welcome back to the NeuroScintilla podcast, where we explore the latest in brain science and translate it into strategies that you can use in clinical practice. I'm Dr. Scott Haggerty, and today we're diving into something that's so fundamental to how the brain works that I honestly think every clinician, regardless of your discipline, needs to understand it. We're talking about brain waves. Now, you've probably seen them before on an EEG printout, those wavy lines labeled delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma. Maybe you've read reports mentioning increased theta activity or reduced alpha power. But here's my question. Do you actually know what those patterns mean? Do you know how they change as we move from infancy to adulthood? Do you know what it means when they deviate from the expected pattern? And why that deviation often tells you more than a structural scan ever could? Today, we're going to take a guided tour through the major brainwave types, what they do, how they evolve across the lifespan, and what happens when they go wrong. And I promise, by the end of this conversation, you'll start to see your patient's challenges through a completely different lens. Let's start with the basics. What a brainwave actually is. When groups of neurons fire together rhythmically, they create oscillations, repeated cycles of electrical activity. These oscillations happen at different speeds, and those speeds are what we call brainwave frequencies. Imagine your brain as an orchestra. Each section, the strings, the bass, the percussion, is playing at its own tempo. Sometimes one section takes the lead, sometimes another. The conductor, in this case, the brain's internal timing network, coordinates all of it so the music works together. We classified brainwaves into five main frequency ranges. Delta is the slowest at less than 4 cycles per second, and it's most prominent during times of sleep. This is when the brain and body repair tissue, consolidate certain kinds of memories, and regulate immune function. Theta runs from about 4 to 8 cycles per second. You see it in states of deep relaxation, daydreaming, and during certain stages of memory encoding. It's also heavily involved in emotional processing. That's why you see it in abundance during early childhood when emotional learning is its most rapid. Alpha falls into 8 to 12 cycles per second range. It's our calm but alert rhythm, and it acts like a gatekeeper. Alpha helps the brain ignore irrelevant information so we can focus on what matters. When you close your eyes and take a deep breath, alpha activity often rises. Beta ranges from about 13 to 30 cycles per second and is associated with active thinking, focused attention, and motor planning. If you're engaged in problem solving, holding a conversation, or even preparing to catch a ball, beta is at work. And then there's gamma. The fastest at 30 cycles per second and beyond, gamma is the integrator. It binds sensory input from multiple regions into a single coherent perception and supports the kind of high-level cognition we use in reasoning, creativity, and even consciousness itself. One of the most important things to understand is that brainwave dominance shifts as we develop. In infancy, delta and theta dominate. The cortex, that wrinkled outer layer, is still immature, so subcortical structures do most of the work. These slower rhythms are perfectly normal and necessary for growth at this stage. As we move into early childhood, alpha and theta begin to rise. This reflects stronger connections between cortical regions, more communication across the brain's executive networks. By adolescence, beta and gamma become more prominent and more coherent. This coherence supports executive function, things like planning, abstract reasoning, and self-regulation. In healthy adulthood, there's a balance. The brain can shift fluidly between states. Slow when rest and recovery are needed, fast when focus and attention are required. And then in aging, we often see a drop in the power of the faster waves and a slowing of the alpha peak frequency. This can be a normal part of aging, but in conditions like dementia, that slowing is more pronounced, sometimes dropping from the normal 10 hertz range down to 8 or even lower. Why should clinicians care? Because if you see a teenager still stuck in high theta, a low beta pattern, or a 50-year-old whose alpha peak is slowed significantly, those can be early signs of dysregulation well before structural damage would ever appear on imaging. Certain oscillatory patterns show up over and over again in clinical work. In ADHD, for example, one of the most common findings is an elevated theta to beta ratio in the frontal cortex. The brain is spending too much time in a slower, internally focused state when it should be able to switch into faster, task-focused modes. There's also often poor coherence between the frontal and parietal regions, meaning attention and executive control aren't well coordinated. In autism spectrum disorder, we often see weak alpha-gamma coupling in occipital and temporal regions. That coupling is essential for integrating sensory information, so when it's weak, you may see the sensory overload and social integration challenges that are really common in ASD. In anxiety disorders, high beta activity often dominates, especially in frontal and central regions. With a reduction in alpha modulation, the ability to calm and relax itself, The brain can't easily downshift into calmer states, so the person stays locked in a heightened vigilance mode. The big takeaway here is that brainwave analysis is about function. It's not just about whether there's a lesion or a shrinkage in volume. It's about how well the brain is managing its own timing and coordination. If we can recognize these patterns early, we can intervene early. We can tailor interventions to help the brain to regain the flexibility to shift states appropriately. That could be through neurofeedback, targeted stimulation, specific cognitive training, and yes, in my own work, by using chiropractic care and photobiomodulation that both influence oscillatory networks. But that's a conversation totally for another day. And in fact, it's the focus of the paid edition of this week's NeuroScintilla newsletter, where I go into how I apply this in real world cases. If you found this conversation eye-opening, the free article Brainwaves 101 on NeuroScintilla takes this material far deeper. I break down cross-frequency coupling, how slower waves to the timing windows for bursts of faster activity, and why that's often a better predictor of performance than power alone. I also show you lifespan maps of brainwave development and the oscillatory signatures of major neurodevelopmental disorders. If you're curious about how we take this knowledge and apply it, and how we look at things like acute EEG, identify dysfunctional patterns, and develop a reasoning map for intervention, that's all in the paid edition. We even go through cases like autistic children with sensory overload, executives with decision fatigue, and older adults with mild cognitive impairment. So if you want to learn more, go and subscribe to NeuroScintilla on Substack. And that's just simply neuroscintilla.substack.com. Start with a free article. And when you're ready to go deeper into application, you'll find the paid edition there waiting for you. I'm Dr. Scott Haggerty. This is the NeuroScintilla podcast, and I'll see you guys next time.